Basquiat's work represents a lot of different things.
I think Basquiat's image language and his painting language is really unique.
I think his paintings were very schematic. They were skeletal. They were always skeletal.
His work relates to a tradition that's really that was also emergent at the same time, which was hip hop.
It's not only about the death. It's about the life.
In a way, he's more relevant today than any other artist in the 20th century.
My first introduction to Basquiat was in 1997 when I was a student in Ohio. And we were taking a field trip to New York, and it was my first time going to New York. And the movie that they played on the bus was Julian Schnabel's film, Basquiat, which at the time, not knowing New York and not really knowing that much about Basquiat, it was really exciting. I mean, I was really young. So I just thought, oh, that's what New York must be like. So it was hard to separate him as an artist from this sort of figure in the art world, and also from my idea of like what I thought New York was like.
I was going back to New York, or back to DC. I was in school in DC. And I read that he was having a show opening, but I was scheduled to fly out the next Saturday morning, and the show didn't open till Saturday evening. And so I decided to just go up to the gallery and see if I could see the work, in person. And, this was a different time, like in the art world, it's just a totally different time. I just walked in casually. The doors were open. There was a person touching up the walls, they were just painting around, and the whole show was laid out. And another young white guy, I guess, who was working there. And I just sort of walked in and I said, hey, I'm really interested in seeing the work, but I gotta bounce. Like, can I come in? He said, yeah, man, sure, just, walk around. So I just walked, and I remember, like, in particular, like, Chinese New Year's, and some of those paintings were in the show. I mean, paintings that have kind of gone on to be kind of very well known. And I just sort of was casually walking around looking at the paintings. And this woman, white woman, older, not old, but older than I was at the time. She probably was in her early 30s or something. Came up to me and just started chatting me up. This is so interesting. We're talking. She's talking. Just like, and just trying to say, you want to go get a drink? And I was like shocked, like, what? And the guy who was working on the thing, he started laughing in the background. And she turned and said, this is not the artist? And the guy says, no. It's not the artist. I don't look anything like Basquiat at all.
One of the times I think I first saw Basquiat was in Houston, but this was one of the first times I was really kind of moved by a Basquiat painting, and it's this skeleton riding a horse, and it was, death, something about riding death, or it's a horse, something like that, and the whole background was silver, and I thought, I don't know, something about that movie, that painting gave me kind of chills, and the way that it was painted, the kind of subject matter of it, and it felt almost like an icon, even though it was the opposite of that. But it felt very much like a painting I found much, much later in Palermo called The Triumph of Death, and it has this similar kind of very, very different, that's a much more ornate, detailed painting from a very, very different period. But there's a similar kind of aspect of this kind of question of mortality and the precariousness of our lives.
Before I saw the work, I heard about him. And then I was saying, wow, I didn't heard about black guy, and I mean, African American doing the painting, become farmer. No, I was like, I'm looking for someone like that anyway. But I was like so happy, because I can see myself in Jean.
I think the first time I saw Sutter work, actually, isn't you kind of growing up in Brooklyn, New York, you're like a young black kid, and we kind of have similar biographies, Haitian dad, Brooklyn, blah, blah, blah. People kind of used to mention him super early on. But I kind of rejected him because I really hated like people ascribing something to me.
In 88, I heard you're coming to Paris to do the show with Yvon Lambert. I didn't believe it, And then say, okay, I gotta go now. And a friend of mine say, yeah, you gotta come. You want to see the work in person. I said, okay. And I went there. And then first move to the gallery, I saw one tall black guy come to me. And then he started to say hi to me. And then he asked me what I'm doing. I say, I'm a painter, I'm an artist. He said, I really want to see your work. He started like that. And then I say, okay. He said, no, now. I said, Jean, this is your opening, He said, no, we gotta go. And then we left. We went to my studio.
Basquiat felt too close to my bio, too close to and so I never really paid attention. And then I think there was two back-to-back. I can't really tell which was. There was an exhibition at Gagosian, and there was one at the Brooklyn Museum. And both of those I went several times to. And there were these 3 images. I think it was called Famous Negro. It was just these black and white sketches of the head. And I just was so jarred by that. It was so graphic, but so just exactly what it needed to be, that I kind of let my guard down. I was like, okay, this is it.
But I definitely remember the way he occupied a space similar to Michael Jackson. Now I'm going to try to describe this a little bit. Michael Jackson is the first young black person I knew who was in the public arena, outside of sports, in the public arena in the way that he was. 7 years old, Michael Jackson's 2-3 years older than me and Basquiat, because, we're 2 weeks apart. I'm November 30th, 1960. He's December, first 2 weeks of 1960. So we're roughly almost the same age. So it's a lot of inside stuff it's very specific to a time period. So I know Michael Jackson existed him in a very similar way because there was no precedent for Michael Jackson at the time. You got when he was on the Ed Sullivan Show in whatever, 66 or 67, he was 7 or 8 years old and ruling the stage, owning the stage, right? What I'm trying to say is Jean-Michel was very similar to that. Later, because he's not a preteen, but he's 19, 20 when he first pops on the scene. So paying attention to his art wasn't just paying attention to Jean-Michel Basquiat, the person. It was paying attention to a person who really was on the bleeding edge of what might be possible for black people in general.
Basquiat was formed in an era of New York that's very different today than it is a few generations ago. So for example, New York had all these, New York's interesting because it's not so much, at least back then, was divided by class or race or whatever. It was so much about your participation in certain cultural identities. So in '68, for example, you had this Stonewall riot, and if you happen to be gay and you went into those disco clubs, it didn't matter if you were wealthy, you were white, you were black, you were Mexican, you were trans, you enjoyed that disco club was you were meeting each other in that cultural moment. And so Basquiat was very much like leaving his neighborhood, going into the city, and the Lower East Side was a very particular cultural moment. And that meant that you could be, as long as you participated in the codes of that culture, it didn't matter who you were really.
And his work relates to a tradition that's really that was also emergent at the same time, which was hip hop. Like, hip hop has become a ubiquitous global language of music now. It's something that is morphing and changing, and is but the tools of hip hop, the structure of hip hop, the capability of sampling and restructuring and chopping and screwing, and all of that comes out of this moment in the 80s as well, in the late 70s, and Basquiat was coming out of that same moment.
One of the things I think that was always really an interesting kind of fact was the first #1 hip hop song, first time most people heard hip hop. And this was the rise of MTV and video music and all of that, was Blondie's Rapture. And when Debbie Harry is rapping, because the song goes from like a disco-infused song to all of a sudden hip-hop. And it's a scene of a turntable, and the turntable starts to rise up, and it's Debbie Harry, and she's rapping to Jean-Michel Basquiat. And the time that for the first time most people hear hip-hop, without knowing, they're also looking at Basquiat. And I think that says a lot about him, that here's Debbie Harry, who Madonna is looking at to understand how to become a pop musician, who also happens to be his girlfriend. And the time that people are now hearing hip hop, the most dominant genre of music, he's the first person that they would have seen without knowing that they're seeing this guy.
I want to say all of that was coming out of a very politically repressive moment in the United States, similar to what we're going through now, except the Reagan years, that were really intentionally trying to roll back a lot of the gains from the Civil Rights Act in the late 60s that we lived through in the 70s. So you have these kind of leaps forwards and then this kind of reversal of things culturally in the United States. And Basquiat and hip hop and all artists working in that moment with that, he's one of the most well-known, but he's also one of the only African-American artists who got attention at that time.
When I was a teenager, my late teens or 20s, there was no black artists in the art world. There were black artists, but not in the art world. And so when Jean-Michel's thing popped the way it did, it was sort of like you couldn't quite understand it. It was a little like a person who was moving in a different sort of time-space continuum to everything that was around. And that's very, it creates a lot of pressure on you. Like when you're the only one. It's like Jean-Michel said, I want to be the Jimi Hendrix of the art world. You have to be careful what you ask for. He is the Jimi Hendrix of the art world. He had this moment where it was a blast, it's undeniable, and he's dead at 27.
There's many things that I see in him that I think one of those things that I always say, that I've said a couple times, is today we'd use of words like foundational Black American. Basquiat isn't a foundational Black American. His dad is Haitian and his mom is Puerto Rican. Not that Puerto Rico is not part of America, but it's a very different American story and a Caribbean story. And so in many ways, the ability to be in spaces that if you were like a Black American kid from like the global, like your grandparents was from Alabama, you wouldn't feel as comfortable in the spaces that Basquiat felt comfortable in. I mean, he felt very comfortable dating Madonna, being in the art world, although that was much more complicated. I think if you were like quote unquote a foundational Black American, those spaces carry much more scars than if you're like kids of immigrants. And so in a way, that's one of those things that is also true for me, is that I don't have as much of those scars or historical baggage entering those spaces. Neither do Obama, for example. Obama is like African American, his dad is from Kenya. So Michelle Obama has a very different relationship with those spaces, those quote unquote white spaces, than Basquiat or Barack Obama or myself.
Jean-Michel was very curious about everything. You know, you want to know even food. You know, his dad was a Haitian, his mom was a Puerto Rican. You know, other friend was a white boy. You know, everything. You know, Jean-Michel was like that. He was not. You cannot put Jean-Michel in a cage. No way. But he was special. Jean-Michel was special. I mean, he worked fast. That's the one thing. And then, second, he working all the time. You know, example, we went in the nightclub together when I moved to New York. He invited me to New York. We went to the nightclub. We went to the kissing birthday party. And then he's come to me and say, hey, listen, if you don't see me, don't look for me. I'll be home. And then 2 hours after I went back home, he was there working. I think we want to be the best. He wanted the best. And then also, you got to work 3 times, 4 times. Because it was like it was not only one being in our world, like a black guy or something like that, but he knew it. He knew his position.
Well, the content of the work has a lot of the struggle of being a person of African descent in a context that is violent, that is pretty violent against that person, that culture, or that person, and that exhibits a lot of kind of, bias against that person. So when you're experiencing that and negotiating that, a lot of what he's doing in the work, I think, and in his own sense of, I don't think there's one drawing that I've looked at that doesn't think about double consciousness, that's not playing with aspects of the subconscious and the social, the internal and the external. They're always a part of what he's playing with, and text, words as part of thoughts, and systems, like in terms of thinking about that. So I think he's constantly interrogating all of that, I think.
It's America, okay? He's a black person. He was open to all the culture. He know his situation, that's why you gotta work 3-4 times. Like you know that, But I don't think you just want to build the work just for black culture. No. Jean-Michel is, listen, if you listen, listen, Jimi Hendrix. When Jimmy play, what do you think? Is it white, is it boy, is it what? Is it black, is it what? No, it's a Jimmy. That's it. Jean-Michel is Jean-Michel.
I think the question is, Basquiat a black painter is an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I make this argument a couple times. I think we live in cultural states, not like, and I'm not saying that race isn't a thing that isn't really deeply important to how one understands oneself. But I think Basquiat really lived in a culture state, and that blackness was a culture state that he was in, but not so much his zone of living. I think there are many artists who live in the cultural state of Blackness, which is an incredibly diverse, ever-giving thing. I think he lived in a cultural state of art in a weird way. Like his, when you're choosing to be in a certain culture state, I think it also means you choose who your parents are. So Rauschenberg, Warhol is as much as that, his parents, his uncles, as his actual uncles. But so was Miles Davis, and so was many of the other great artists of the time. Michelangelo, both historically and musically. And I think he exists in a culture state for many people today.
My first impression of seeing the series of the heads, I was really surprised. I mean, they're really pared down. They feel like the subjects are either going into them, like there's a head within a head, or like a helmet, or a mask, and then or a skull, and then all the energy that emanates out from them, like whether it's like mental states or thought, or heat, or pain, or smells, like everything that becomes this kind of non-physical, frenetic subjecthood that just emanates out from this head, from this container. And even with the eyes feel like they're kind of really socketed, and they're circled, and everything feels like they could be like robots, or some of them feel like they could feel like robots or Frankenstein kind of figures, and the body feels like it becomes a conduit for all of this emotional activity or emotional states.
How I read the heads was that it was a form that allowed so much of his curiosities to just be dumped into. And so sometimes you see his heads as just formal experiments about just line and color. Sometimes you would see it as kind of biological explorations, biographical explorations, geological explorations. So I think he just allowed it cultural explorations. I think it just was a form that said, okay, I know this form, but any thought that I'm having at 10:01, I can dump it into this form.
As a painter, I see these drawings as very much like the depictions from an abstract painter. Like it's interesting with Basquiat because he'll use figures, but they always feel like they're talking about something that is sort of non-embodied, like which is something like almost like energy that's on the way to the next form, or they're in movement, and and the way that the gestures work are completely abstract. Like I feel like he's such an abstract painter, and there's a kind of wild energy to them.
I think in the heads there's this immediacy, but what's to me the most interesting about the heads is again this playing with the idea of the consciousness, the subconscious, the kind of life and death. What happens in the liminal space or the intermediate space, the intermediary space in between. It's that I think there's this constant play with that, skinless with skin. Very, very rarely do you actually have skin. It's usually the skeleton, but it's also the skeleton within an envelope an abstracted envelope or something like that, and then the organs are kind of sometimes in, sometimes not, sometimes falling apart, sometimes not. So and then there's the brain, which is always drawn as some kind of like psycho-computer, pre-computer idea of a computer kind of thing.
When I look at Basquiat's heads, what comes to my mind is just like what we call them, heads. You know, if you say heads in the Black community, it doesn't just mean like literally, or mostly does not mean literally the head. What it means is like to think. It means to think. So like if somebody's listening to John Coltrane or some music that's not like, you know, something that, let's say, the mainstream would be following. You say it's heads. Like, or if you're into, like last night, I was having a conversation with people about Italian cinema. You could say those are heads. Because that's like some Gnostic. There's a Gnostic dimension to it, you know what I mean? Particularly with Black folks, where we supposedly don't think, which is ridiculous because we think harder than anybody or else we wouldn't have survived. You know what I mean? Thinking is part of, it's a life and death thing for us. It's not like whether you're a billionaire or not. It's like life and death for us thinking. So I think in his work there is the mention of that, like thinking in overdrive. And the heads are just kind of metaphors for that. Like, you know, I think there's a death thread in his work from the beginning. It's almost like, you know, his mom gives him Grey's Anatomy, he gets hit by a car when he's a kid, he doesn't die. Like there's an alternate universe where he died at whatever, 12 or 14 when he was hit, but he doesn't die. So like in a way, he's living almost in the after causal wake of not dying. So it haunts. It's like, this is like a sort of poetic reading of him, but it's haunting his life. These skeletons are haunting him from the beginning, you know? So the head thing is, it means to think intensely, meaning it's localized in the head. It also is clearly, just on the Haitian tip, it's a voodoo trope. You know, when you see Dambala, Elegba, there's a skull on a person's face. You know, I've said this recently, everybody's the skull trying to get out, you know? And his skull just got out quicker than anybody else. It's like you could see the skull trying to get out, trying to transcend like his physical limits from the beginning. And maybe that's just because in that moment when he got hit by the car and his mom gave him Grey's Anatomy, you know, he could have died or should have died. Who knows? Who knows? But I think it's a clear strand in his work. So if I see a bunch of heads, that's like going to Naples and seeing a bunch of skulls in the crypts. That's kind of like just immediately without even being so deep about it. That's what it is. He was haunted by that. So
I think already the head you draw, they also spiritual way, because Jean, he have a memoir culture, from Haiti. It's like when you draw all the heads, it's not about only about the death. It's very deep. It's about a life, because it's not death is not the end. You know, death is a life. You know, donc for me, Jean, it was like a lot of people think about death. He doesn't think about death. I think it's about a life. You know, so people get it understand it, because we talk a lot about that. It's not about the death. It's a life. You take an Haitian culture, it's the voodoo, all of this element is about a life. Invisible, spiritual. That's it.
I think his kind of effort to make sense of this fucked up world and the beauties of the world and the joys of the world and all of that, and the body and himself and who he is, and like that subconscious, all of that is kind of explored in those. So to me, yeah, it's like the edge of death, the edge of being, feeling paranoid, the kind of space that is like also exuberant, but also paranoid, but also falling apart, or also beaten up, or all of this comes out in the drawings. The poet, and kind of the Caesar, the falling from power, the fall of grace, all of this, you can think of all of these larger ideas as very, I think they're very apparent in the drawings, or come through to me.
There's this idea that like in painting, Matisse liberated color in the Western culture. So that's where you get like Ellsworth Kelly and all of those from color field theory. I think Basquiat liberated this idea of the portrait and your face being a portrait. That it's much more now about anything, really. And in a weird way, I know this wasn't necessarily where his mind was at, but in 5 years, people will have meta glasses or whatever, AI glasses, and your head could be anything that you choose it to be. And I will see your head how you want it to be. And it will be not about changing, your lips to be fuller or thinner or whatever, but like your head to be anything that you want it to be.
It's interesting that he kept all these drawings for himself, that they weren't shown. And that's a mystery to me. I know why I wouldn't show things, or like I work on drawings and keep them in the studio because they're kind of feel like they're closer to process than they are to a finished piece. So sometimes I don't even see them as art. But these feel like finished. So I was like looking to see like, did he sign them? Or like, how did he think about them?
If the drawings are these kind of explosions of energy, or like bursts of creativity that just pour out, there's also to keep revisiting something is in a form is to challenge it, is to interrogate it, is to question it, is to kind of is like, when something's nagging you, an idea, and you keep going back to that idea and you keep kind of mulling it over. That's part of that interrogation and that internal kind of investigation in the work. And I think that's what you can see, what feels really apparent in the head drawings.
I think Basquiat's investigation in the heads, one of the great sad things is that we never know what time would have allowed it to, as he became 30 years old, 35, and these things begin to form a meaning in a more concise way, a more like that. I don't know what it would have evolved to become, and what those things what would have stuck, what would have dropped. What you see is just like a constant exploration of so many different ideas, but in such a unique way. But ultimately, as we age, things stick and things fall off. And then the things that stick, we investigate it more and more and more and more. It becomes much more who we are, much more of a defining understanding of our quote-unquote more mature self. I think the sad truth is we don't know what that would have been.
Because he has there's a feeling, an energy that's all his own, but it also feels like maybe coming from something from abstract expressionism, but then it's totally contemporary, and melding the world, like folding the world into it. And I was always really admired how he was able to have this freshness and immediacy to his work, and that he would have these sort of bold planes of color, but then be able to incorporate all this drawing and different mark making. And they just felt so free. So I think that was something that I thought was really inspiring about his paintings.
Because to a certain degree, and this is not to say anything except to point it out, his paintings were drawings, you know what I mean? Very lines, oil sticks, this kind of stuff. And I always like to say at a certain point, like in the same way that you see Gray's Anatomy and the skeletal nature haunting his work in general, thematically and formally, like I think his paintings were very schematic. They were skeletal. They were always skeletal. You know, they were always diagrammatic. They were like diagrams.
He was interested in systems and kind of interrogating them and trying to understand them, and then how can you put it back together, especially if a system is broken, especially if a system is carceral, especially if a system is enforcing. So I think he was interested in the system of something, but and how to disassemble that, and how does one invent a different one. But he was also interested in the fugitive, and I think you really see that in this work. In the drawings, it's this place between, like I said, life and not living. And what does that mean? The kind of afterlife, meaning not living in the afterlife, but what happens to the body.
And then they also have to work purely visually too. You know what I mean? They have to just hold your eye, color, form, things like this. So that's something that I'm like acutely aware of in his work, and I'm thinking about it in my own work. Like, how do you make a painting, a picture that, well, first of all, can just hold your attention, first of all. First thing it's got to do is hold your attention, whatever you think of it. How can it do that in a way that can match what Basquiat was able to do without, of course, imitating it? Because there's a whole industry of Basquiat imitators, you know what I mean? None of whom, I don't think there's inherently anything wrong with imitating great artists. The history of Western painting is people imitating, you know, people's like a style. Like you see that sort of Renaissance painting thing, it's a style. We see it, we know it. But so it's interesting to me just to think, like I said, I was gonna say this thing about all the imitators of Basquiat. That shit looks simple, but it's not simple. That's why there's not a single person who we can point to who was able to replicate his thing and extend it, that I know of. And I've seen a lot of people try. You always know immediately what they're imitating. At the same time, you know immediately it's not a Basquiat. They can't even be forged. People have tried to forge these things. Nobody's done it successfully because there are things in his work like how his line functions. I'm not talking about what he's drawing or his drafting skill. His line is very specific. That's why if you see like things like, you know, like he wrote on a memo in a hotel, out to get ribs or something. You know, it's not a drawing, he just wrote out to get ribs. And this shit in some ways is just as visually interesting and startling as any complex drawing he did. That's because of his line, that's how his line functions. And in a way, like his extension of Cy Twombly, nobody's been able to extend him like he extended Cy Twombly, for example.
Jean-Michel will work everywhere in the studio. I mean, even in the room, the bedroom. He was like make all the drawing and then watch the TV at the same time. You know, talk on the phone and working. You know, I think, yeah, absolutely.
And where does his energy come from? Why did he work so much?
Because there was so many things to say. When you have so many things to say, so many, culturally, politically, spiritually, and then you don't stop. You want a better life for people.
Basquiat's work represents a lot of different things. I think on one end, we are living in a hip hop moment. That's like the global culture that is being embraced. And the person who made one of the most brilliant artworks at the very beginning of that is Basquiat. So in a way, he's more relevant today than any other artist in the 20th century.
I think Basquiat has influenced so many artists, and so many non-artists too, like people who are kind of outside of the art world or in different strains of artistic process, like fashion or music. And I think he's had such a cultural impact.
He's the bar, just like he's the bar. He's the bar in terms of like a person actualizing their thing. Like even though he had a relatively short lifespan, you can't look at that work and not be amazed by the scope of it. It's just like, even if you don't like it, you still cannot deny the intensity and the breadth of it, in such a short period of time. It doesn't even matter. If you had done that body of work in 20 years, it would have been the same. It wouldn't have been any different. It's an undeniable body of work.
You'll go through museums and you'll see work, paintings of all these different natures, and that are kind of in a room with contemporaries of other artists. But somehow, that one Rembrandt calls you to it, or that one Caravaggio or Rubens or whoever it is, Veronese, or you just get called to certain paintings. And I think that's what's really interesting is what work does that. What work really not just kind of suggests a time period, but also goes way past that and kind of reaches kind of reverberations that we all are kind of a part of in this, whatever you want to call it, the undercommons, the kind of there's a kind of connectivity between us. And I think that, definitely Basquiat's work, I think, has moments of really connecting in that way.
That's why people got to focus on his work, because the work is so powerful. Sometimes people, they don't look the work because it become too big star, But I think people really gotta see to read his work, A lot of young artists they love Jean-Michel, they love his work.
I think Basquiat suffers from something that many artists who get to a certain level suffer from, where people don't necessarily think about how brilliant Frida Kahlo was. If you ever, because she's so famous, you become unaware that they're not just famous, and we live in a place where people are just famous to be famous. Many people that we know of today who are the most successful people in life are just famous because they're famous, not because they actually did anything culturally or whatever. And so Basquiat suffers from that, where he's on the verge of just becoming this thing that's a shorthand for his biography, but not how brilliant he was, that allowed that success to happen. So I think anytime you're doing an exhibition that is extremely considered about his genius and doesn't sort of It's not about the fame, but just like this is someone who was extremely studied, studious, and was brilliant. That's why they became famous. And it wasn't about hustling the system or whatever, but actually he was really brilliant. I think that ends up like becoming a really important thing. I think that's sort of what we need is, wow, these people were smart, and
See the work.
see the work. Yeah, just see the work and see how smart they were.